Hello there, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, to let the day fall away from your shoulders, and to settle into this quiet space we're about to share together. Where in the world are you watching from? Perhaps a bedroom where the evening light is fading, or a quiet corner where you've finally found a moment of peace. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. Tonight we're going to explore the Dutch Golden Age, that remarkable period in the 17th century when a tiny nation of water and wind became the wealthiest place on earth. We'll discover how the Dutch built an empire on wooden ships and careful bookkeeping, how they painted light itself onto canvas, and how they transformed a collection of marshy provinces into the centre of the known world. It's a journey that spans from windswept harbours to tropical spice islands, from counting houses to artist studios, from the chaos of war to the quiet triumph of commerce. Along the way, we'll meet merchants and painters, sailors and engineers, dreamers and practical men who change the shape of history. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a breathless race through dates and battles. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through this extraordinary century, taking our time with each discovery, letting the story unfold at a pace that honours both the complexity of history and your need for rest. By the end, I think you'll find not just knowledge, but a kind of peace in understanding how human ambition and artistry can create something beautiful, even if that beauty doesn't last forever. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, for trusting these stories to carry you towards sleep, so settle in, let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath, and then another. And let's begin our slow drift through the Dutch Golden Age when Amsterdam ruled the seas. There's nowhere you need to be right now, nothing you need to do, just listen and let the story unfold like a painting emerging from darkness into light. Let's begin where all journeys begin, with the land itself. Picture, if you will, the coastline of northwestern Europe in the early 17th century. The North Sea stretches grey and restless to the horizon, and where the water meets the land, there is no clear boundary. The Netherlands, as we know it, barely exists. What does exist is a collection of marshy provinces, a place where water and earth are engaged in an endless, patient struggle. The land sits low, much of it below sea level, a fact that would seem to doom any hope of prosperity. Rivers flow down from the German highlands and empty into the sea here, depositing their sediment across wide deltas, the Rhine, the Meuse, the Scheldt. These are not just rivers but networks of channels, constantly shifting, creating islands and peninsulas that appear and disappear with the seasons. When storms blow in from the North Sea, the water rises and claims the land. When the storms pass, the land emerges again, sodden and uncertain. This is not promising country for building an empire. There is little solid ground for cities, no natural harbours of any depth, no great forest for timber, no mountains rich with ore. The soil, where it can be found, is decent enough for farming, but there is never quite enough of it. What the Dutch provinces have more than anything is water. Water in the rivers, water in the sea, water falling from the sky, water seeping up from below. It is a landscape that demands either surrender or ingenuity, and so the people who lived here for centuries before our story truly begins became experts in the relationship between land and sea. They built dikes, those patient walls of earth and stone that hold back the water. They dug canals to move water where they wanted it to go. They created polders, those remarkable parcels of land reclaimed from the sea itself, protected by dikes and drained by windmills. Generation after generation, they pushed back against the water, one small victory at a time. By 1600, when our story begins in earnest, the Dutch provinces had been shaped by water for so long that water had become not an enemy, but a tool. canals that drained the land also connected the cities. The dikes that held back the sea also created harbours. The very wetness of the landscape, which made agriculture difficult, made trade essential. And trade, as we'll discover, was where the Dutch would find their fortune. But first, they had to survive. And survival in this low country meant understanding water better than anyone else in the world. Which brings us to the people who made that understanding into an art form, the engineers who didn't just live with water, but learned to command it. To understand the Dutch Golden Age, you must first understand the windmill. Not as a quaint piece of folklore, but as a machine of survival. Stand on the flat landscape of Holland in 1600, and you would see them everywhere, their great arms turning slowly against the sky, patient as the tides. These were not the windmills of romance. They were pumps, engineered with remarkable sophistication to lift water from the land and pour it into canals that carried it away to the sea. The principle was simple enough. The wind turned the arms turned gears, the gears turned a screw or a paddle wheel that lifted water from a lower level to a higher one. But the execution required precision. The millwright who built these machines understood ratios and tolerances, wind speeds and water volumes. They were engineers, though that word had not yet taken on its modern meaning. Consider the Beemster polder, reclaimed beginning in 1612. This was not a small undertaking. The area covered nearly 70 square kilometres, a shallow lake that had been part of the landscape for as long as anyone could remember. To drain it required first building a dike around the entire perimeter, a ring of earth strong enough to hold back the water. Then came the windmills, 43 of them, arranged in a careful sequence. The first ring of mills lifted water from the lake bed into a canal. The second ring lifted it again, higher. The third ring, if needed, lifted it once more until finally the water flowed out into the sea. It took 4 years to drain the Beemster, 4 years of constant pumping, the windmills turning day and night whenever the wind blew, and when it was done, there was land where there had been water. Good land, flat and rich, ready for farming. But more than that, there was proof. Proof that the Dutch could create land itself, could push back the boundaries of what was possible through nothing more than engineering and perseverance. This mindset, this belief that nature could be measured and managed and improved upon, would become central to Dutch success. It wasn't enough to accept the world as it was. You studied it, calculated it, and then you changed it. The same principles that governed the drainage of a polder would soon govern the trade routes to the East Indies, the construction of ships, the organisation of companies. But there was something else the water engineers understood. Something more philosophical. They knew that their work was never finished. A dike required constant maintenance. A windmill needed repairs. The sea was always there, patient and powerful, waiting for any weakness. One storm, one breach in the dike, and years of work could be undone in a single night. The Great Flood of 1621, the St. Felix Flood, killed thousands and reclaimed land that had been dry for generations. So the engineers built with care, but also with humility. They knew they were not conquering nature, only negotiating with it, creating a temporary arrangement that required constant attention. This understanding, too, would shape the Dutch character. Success was not permanent. Prosperity required vigilance. The sea taught them that nothing lasts forever, but with skill and patience, you could make something beautiful while it did last. And with that lesson learned from water and wind, they were ready to turn their attention to the sea itself and to the freedom they would need to sail it. But before the Golden Age could begin, there had to be a breaking. The Dutch provinces in 1568 were not an independent nation. They were part of the Spanish Netherlands, ruled from distant Madrid by King Philip II, a man who believed in absolute monarchy and absolute Catholicism with equal fervour. And the Dutch, increasingly Protestant and increasingly unwilling to be governed by a foreign king, found themselves moving toward rebellion. The 80 Years' War, as it would come to be known, began not with a declaration but with a series of small refusals. provinces declining to pay taxes they considered unjust, cities closing their gates to Spanish soldiers, preachers giving sermons in Dutch instead of Latin, speaking of conscience and individual faith. These were quiet acts of defiance, but they accumulated. By 1568, the rebellion had become something Philip could no longer ignore. The war itself was long and complicated, full of sieges and betrayals, heroism and suffering. Spanish armies marched north, well-equipped and professional. Dutch forces, less organised but intimately familiar with the landscape, learned to use the water as a weapon. They would break the dikes, flooding the land deliberately, creating barriers that no army could cross. Spanish soldiers would arrive at a city ready for siege, only to find it surrounded by an artificial lake that hadn't existed the week before. The most famous of these defensive inundations came in 1574, during the siege of Leiden. The Spanish had surrounded the city, cutting off all supply routes. Starvation set in. People ate rats, boiled leather, anything they could find. The city seemed certain to fall. But William of Orange, leading the Dutch rebellion, ordered the dikes broken. Water poured across the land, slowly rising, and with it came ships carrying food and reinforcements. The Spanish, watching the water rise around their positions, had to retreat or drown. Leyden was saved, and the Dutch learned something important. The very landscape that made their provinces seem weak could be turned into their strongest defence. The war continued for decades. There were truces and renewed fighting, territories gained and lost. But slowly, gradually, the northern provinces established their independence, not through a single decisive battle, but through persistence, through their willingness to flood their own land rather than surrender, through their ability to outlast an empire that was fighting wars on multiple fronts across Europe and the Americas. By 1609, when a 12-year truce was signed, the Dutch Republic was effectively independent, though official recognition would not come until 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. But the war had done more than create a new nation. It had forged a particular kind of national character. The Dutch had learned that they could not rely on kings or nobles to defend them. They had defended themselves collectively. The provinces had worked together, pooling resources, making decisions through councils and committees rather than royal decree. This would become the model for their government. Not a monarchy, but a republic. Not rule by birthright, but rule by consent and commercial interest. The same merchants who funded the war would soon fund trading companies. The same organisational skills that coordinated the defence of multiple provinces would coordinate trade across multiple oceans. The war had taught them they could accomplish remarkable things through cooperation and careful planning, and now, with peace at hand, they were ready to turn those lessons toward a different kind of conquest. One measured not in territory taken, but in cargo delivered and profits earned, which brings us to the ships that would make that conquest possible. Picture a government built not on power, but on argument. The Dutch Republic, officially the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, was an experiment in collective governance that seemed designed to frustrate anyone seeking clear authority. There was no king. Instead, each province had its own assembly, the Staten, made up of representatives from the cities and the nobility. These provincial assemblies sent delegates to the States General, the National Assembly, which met in The Hague to debate matters of common concern. But here was the complication. The States General could not simply vote and decide. Each province had one vote, and major decisions required unanimity. 7 provinces, 7 votes, and if even one province disagreed, the matter could not proceed. This was not efficient. Debates could stretch on for weeks, months, while representatives wrote home for instructions and waited for replies. Foreign ambassadors, accustomed to monarchies where a king's word was law, found the Dutch system bewildering and exasperating, yet somehow it worked. The very slowness of decision-making meant that when decisions were made, they had genuine support. The merchant class that dominated the cities learned to negotiate, to compromise, to find solutions that everyone could accept if not love. And because power was distributed rather than concentrated, no single faction could dominate completely. Holland, the wealthiest province, had the most influence, but even Holland had to persuade the other 6. There was one official who came closest to singular authority. The stadtholder, usually a member of the House of Orange-Nassau, served as military commander and something like a chief executive. But the stadtholder was appointed, not born to the role, and his power was limited by the States General. Some provinces didn't even have a stadtholder. It was a deliberately uncertain arrangement, designed to prevent exactly the kind of absolute rule they had rebelled against. What emerged was a kind of organised chaos that suited the Dutch temperament perfectly. They were practical people, merchants and traders and engineers, accustomed to solving problems through negotiation rather than command. If the government couldn't make quick decisions about war and peace, well, at least it couldn't make quick decisions that destroyed lives and fortunes either. Everything required debate, discussion, the building of consensus. This governmental structure reflected something deeper about Dutch society in the 17th century. Social class mattered certainly. There were rich merchants and poor labourers, educated scholars and illiterate sailors, but the rigid hierarchy of aristocratic Europe had less power here. A successful merchant could become wealthier than most nobles. A talented painter could dine with scholars and politicians. What mattered was not who your father had been, but what you could accomplish, what you could contribute to the common good. The cities themselves were governed by regents, wealthy men who served without pay as a civic duty. They met in town halls to discuss water management and poor relief, trade regulations and city planning. They commissioned paintings for public buildings and funded orphanages and old-age homes. This was not democracy as we would understand it. Most people had no vote, no voice in government. But it was also not pure oligarchy. The regents knew they governed with the consent of the governed. That riots and unrest could topple them if they pushed too far. Out of this messy, argumentative, surprisingly functional system came the stability that made the Golden Age possible. Merchants could plan for the future knowing that law and contract would be respected. Artists could work without fear of royal censorship. Scholars could publish ideas that might be banned elsewhere. The Dutch Republic was not perfect, not even close, but it was predictable. And predictability, for people trying to build something, whether a trading company or a painting or a life, was perhaps more valuable than perfection, and what they built with that precious predictability started with ships unlike any the world had ever seen. Now we come to wood and canvas, to the tools that would carry Dutch ambition across the oceans. The fleet, they called it in Dutch, or the flute in English. And it was revolutionary not because it was fast or powerful, but because it was efficient. In the early 1600s, when other nations built ships designed for war, bristling with cannons and crew, the Dutch built ships designed for cargo. Look at a flute from the outside. It's not beautiful exactly. The hull is rounded and pot-bellied, wider in the middle than at the top or bottom, giving it a pear-shaped cross-section. The deck is narrow, barely wide enough for the crew to work. But below that narrow deck is a vast cargo hold, designed to carry maximum goods with minimum wasted space. The masts are tall but simple, rigged with sails that a small crew could manage. Where a Spanish galleon might require a crew of 200, a float of the same cargo capacity needed 30, perhaps 40 men. This was mathematics translated into wood. Every design choice was about efficiency, about reducing the cost of moving goods from one place to another. The rounded hull was cheaper to build than the straight-sided ships favoured elsewhere. It required less timber, and the timber it did require didn't need to be of the highest quality. The simple rigging meant fewer specialised sailors were needed. The narrow deck meant the ship paid lower port fees, since many harbours charged based on deck width rather than cargo capacity. Dutch shipbuilders in Amsterdam and Rotterdam and Hoorn produced these vessels by the hundreds, then thousands. They didn't craft each ship individually as a work of art. They standardized. They created templates and assembly line methods before there were factories. Timber was cut to standard sizes, components were prefabricated, and a ship could be completed in weeks rather than months. This allowed Dutch merchants to build fleets faster and cheaper than their competitors. But efficiency and design was only part of the innovation. The Dutch also pioneered new methods of ship ownership and operation. A single merchant rarely owned an entire ship. Instead, ships were divided into shares, often 64 of them, and merchants would buy whatever portion they could afford. This spread the risk. If a ship sank, no one merchant was ruined. It also meant that more people had a stake in maritime trade, could participate in ventures they couldn't have funded alone. The fleet changed trade in practical ways that rippled across the world. With lower operating costs, Dutch merchants could charge less for transport and still make a profit. This made them the preferred carriers for goods across Europe. Want to ship grain from Poland to Portugal? Hire a Dutch ship. Need to move wine from France to England? Again, Dutch ships offered the best rates. By the middle of the 17th century, the Dutch Republic had perhaps 15,000 merchant ships, more than half of Europe's entire merchant fleet. These ships became the circulatory system of European trade, moving constantly, carrying grain and timber and wine and fish, connecting ports from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. And the profits from all this carrying trade flowed back to Amsterdam, to the merchants and investors who owned shares in these efficient, unglamorous vessels. The fleet wasn't the most powerful ship on the seas, but it was the most practical, and in trade, practicality counted for more than glory. Yet even these remarkable vessels couldn't sail everywhere. For the longest voyages to the East Indies and eventually to the Americas, something different was needed. Larger ships, armed for protection, capable of carrying not just cargo but the force to protect it, and organising those voyages, funding them, managing the enormous risks and potential rewards would require a new kind of institution entirely. A company unlike any that had existed before, and it's to that company and the empire it would build that we now turn our attention. On the 20th of March, 1602, something new came into being in Amsterdam. The Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, known to history as the VOC, was more than a trading company. It was a corporation in the modern sense. Perhaps the first, and it was given powers that would make any modern corporation envious. The right to wage war, to negotiate treaties, to establish colonies, to coin money, to administer justice in the territories it controlled. The idea was born from necessity and competition. Portuguese traders had dominated the spice trade for a century, sailing around Africa to reach the Indies. But by 1600, Dutch merchants had begun making the same voyage. Forming small companies to fund individual expeditions, this created chaos. Multiple Dutch ships arriving in the same port, competing against each other, driving up the price of spices they were trying to buy, and driving down the price they could charge when they returned home. It was inefficient, wasteful. The solution was consolidation. The States General encouraged, almost forced, the various trading companies to merge into a single entity. The VOC was granted a monopoly on Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. No other Dutch merchant could legally trade in those waters. In exchange, the VOC would coordinate efforts, stabilise prices, and most importantly, challenge Portuguese dominance of the spice trade. The company was organised with startling sophistication. It was a joint stock company, meaning anyone could buy shares, and they did. Merchants certainly, but also shopkeepers and artisans and even servants, people investing whatever they could afford in the hope of profit. The initial subscription raised 6.5 million guilders, an enormous sum, the largest capital accumulation the world had yet seen for a commercial venture. This money funded the construction of ships, the purchasing of trade goods. the establishment of fortified trading posts across Asia. The company was managed by the Heeren 17th, the 17 Gentlemen, a board of directors drawn from the 6 regional chambers that made up the VOC. They met in Amsterdam to set policy, to review reports from the East, to decide which routes to pursue and which to abandon. Below them was a vast administrative machinery, bookkeepers and clerks in Amsterdam tracking every cargo, ships' captains and supercargoes managing trade on distant coasts, governors presiding over colonial settlements, soldiers and sailors enforcing the company's will. What made the VOC revolutionary was its combination of commercial and sovereign powers. This was not just a company that traded, it was a company that governed, that made war and peace, that established law and collected taxes in the territories it controlled. In effect, the VOC became a kind of state, a commercial empire responsible not to a king but to its shareholders. Its primary obligation not to God or country but to profit. And profit there was, at least in the early years. Ships that left Amsterdam in autumn would reach the Indies the following summer, load spices and silk and porcelain, and return a year or more later. When they did, the profits could be extraordinary. A single successful voyage might return 10, 20, even 50 times its initial investment. Not every ship made it back. Storms sank vessels, pirates attacked them, disease killed crew, but enough returned that the company thrived and expanded. By 1620, the VOC had established its headquarters at Batavia, on the island of Java, where Jakarta stands today. From there, it extended its reach across maritime Asia. Trading posts in India and Ceylon, in Malacca and the Moluccas, in Taiwan and Japan. The company negotiated with local rulers, sometimes as equals, sometimes as conquerors. It fought wars against the Portuguese, against the English, against local kingdoms that resisted its monopolistic claims. The VOC became, for a time, the most powerful economic entity in the world. More powerful than most nations, certainly richer. Its ships dominated the Indian Ocean and the waters around Indonesia. Its warehouses in Amsterdam held goods from across Asia, waiting to be sold across Europe, and the dividends it paid to shareholders helped fuel the prosperity of the Dutch Golden Age. But that prosperity had a price, paid in distant waters by people who would never see Amsterdam, and it's to those distant shores and dangerous voyages that our story now travels. Let's talk about pepper, not as a condiment, but as a currency. In 17th century Europe, pepper was expensive enough that it was sometimes used to pay rent, to settle debts, to dowry daughters. A pound of peppercorns might cost a labourer's monthly wages. And pepper was the common spice. Nutmeg, mace, cloves, these were worth far more. A single pound of nutmeg in Amsterdam could be worth enough to buy a small house. The question is why? Why were these dried seeds and bark fragments worth such extraordinary sums? Part of the answer is scarcity. The most valuable spices grew in only a few places in the world, small islands in what is now Indonesia. The Moluccas, the Spice Islands, were barely dots on a map, but they were the only source of cloves and nutmeg. Controlling those islands meant controlling a monopoly on goods that all of Europe wanted. But scarcity alone doesn't explain the value. Demand played an equal role. Europeans in the 17th century wanted spices for practical reasons. Meat preservation required salt, but salt alone made for monotonous eating. Spices masked the taste of preserved meat, made ordinary food more palatable. They were used in medicine, in perfumes, in religious ceremonies. But beyond utility was desire. Spices represented luxury, sophistication, connection to distant exotic lands. To serve heavily spiced food was to display wealth and cosmopolitan taste. The VOC understood that their profits depended on maintaining both scarcity and desire. They controlled supply ruthlessly. In the Moluccas, they enforced their monopoly with violence when necessary. Clove trees that grew outside VOC-controlled islands were destroyed. local populations were sometimes forced to relocate to concentrate production where the company could monitor it. Ships that tried to trade spices independently risked being seized or sunk. This was not gentle commerce. This was monopoly capitalism enforced by cannon and sword. The company maintained forts and garrisons across the Indies, not primarily to defend against European rivals, though that was part of it, but to control the local population and suppress any competition. The Banda Islands, source of nutmeg, saw their population decimated when they resisted VOC control. Thousands were killed or enslaved, the survivors forced to work on VOC plantations. Yet in Amsterdam, this violence was remote, abstract. What mattered there was the cargo. Ships arriving at the docks unloaded sacks of pepper and cinnamon, chests of nutmeg and mace, bundles of cloves. The spices were stored in massive warehouses, then sold at carefully managed auctions designed to maintain high prices. The VOC didn't dump their entire stock on the market at once. They released goods gradually, ensuring that supply never quite met demand, that prices stayed high. The profit margins were extraordinary. Spices purchased in the Indies for a few pennies worth of trade goods, simple cloth or iron tools or glass beads, sold in Amsterdam for many guilders per pound. Even accounting for the enormous costs of ships and crew, of forts and soldiers, of administration and losses to storms and pirates, the profits made the VOC's shareholders wealthy. But there's something worth considering here, something that goes beyond economics. The spice trade represented a kind of alchemy. Raw materials, plants that grew wild or were cultivated by Indonesian farmers, were transformed through violence and monopoly into luxury goods that defined European high culture. The distance between the Moluccas and Amsterdam, the months of sailing, the dangers endured, all of this was necessary to create the value. If cloves had grown in Holland, they would have been worthless. Scarcity was created not just by nature but by geography, and by the VOC's willingness to enforce its claims with force. And yet, even as the spices made fortunes, they were just the beginning. The VOC's ships carried other goods as well. Silk from China, porcelain, coffee, tea, indigo, precious woods. Each cargo expanded European tastes, created new markets, new desires. The East India trade was not just about moving goods, but about transforming culture, about making the exotic familiar and the familiar insufficient. And managing all this, coordinating ships across oceans, required voyages of extraordinary endurance and danger, which is where we'll turn our attention next. Imagine the moment of departure. A VOC ship at anchor in Amsterdam harbour, the crew making final preparations. The vessel is loaded deep with trade goods, with iron and cloth and silver, with supplies for a voyage that will last more than a year if all goes well. The crew numbers perhaps 150 men, sailors and soldiers and merchants. Some are experienced, veterans of previous voyages. Others are raw recruits, teenage boys who have never seen the ocean. Many will not return. The ship leaves in autumn, typically October or November, to catch favourable winds down the coast of Europe and Africa. The first leg is through familiar waters, south past England and France, past Spain and Portugal. Then comes the open Atlantic, weeks without sight of land, the ship rolling in the long swells, the crew settling into the rhythm of watches and labour. Sailors climb the rigging to adjust sails, the officers navigate by sun and stars, the ship's routine becomes their entire world. The first major landmark is the Cape Verde Islands, off the West African coast, where the ship might stop for fresh water and provisions. Then comes the long crossing of the South Atlantic. The ship swings wide to the west to catch the trade winds. A route that would become standard, but in the early 17th century was still being refined through trial and error. This is the doldrums, where winds can die for days or weeks, leaving the ship motionless on a glassy sea. The water supplies dwindle, tempers fray. If the winds return, the ship crosses the equator and bends back east, making for the southern tip of Africa. The Cape of Good Hope, the Dutch called it, though sailors knew it could just as easily be the Cape of Storms. Here the Atlantic meets the Indian Ocean, and the meeting is violent. Waves the size of houses, winds that can drive a ship backward despite full sails. Rounding the Cape in winter, which was the Dutch summer and therefore sailing season, meant facing some of the worst weather on Earth. Ships were lost here regularly, driven onto rocks, or simply overwhelmed by the sea and sent to the bottom with all hands. The ones that survived emerged into the Indian Ocean battered and leaking, their crew exhausted, and the voyage was not yet half done. From the Cape to Batavia was another 10,000 kilometres, months more of sailing. The ships made for the roaring 40s, the belt of powerful westerly winds that circle the Antarctic, using them to speed east across the Indian Ocean. Navigation here was inexact. Latitude could be measured with reasonable accuracy by observing the sun, but longitude was guesswork. Ships aimed for the western coast of Australia, where they would turn north, following the coast up toward the Indonesian archipelago, but misjudged the distance, and you could sail too far east, missing the coast entirely and finding yourself in the empty Pacific, or turn north too soon and make slow progress against contrary winds. Life aboard ship during these months was difficult in ways hard to imagine. The crew lived on hard biscuit and salted meat, food that was barely nutritious when fresh and grew worse with time. The biscuit became infested with weevils. The meat turned rank. Fresh water, stored in wooden casks, grew slimy and foul. After a few months at sea, scurvy would begin to appear. Gums bleeding, teeth loosening, old wounds reopening. Men became too weak to work and died in the dark, cramped hold. The officers had slightly better conditions, private cabins and access to better food. But they were not immune to disease or to the ocean's violence. When a storm struck, everyone was equally at risk. And storms in the Indian Ocean could last days, the ship fighting for survival, waves washing across the deck, carrying away anything not securely lashed down. Sometimes they carried away men. But if the ship survived, if luck and skill brought it through, then eventually land would appear on the horizon. The islands of Indonesia, green and mountainous, rising from the blue water. The scent of the land would reach the ship before the land itself was visible, the smell of tropical vegetation and smoke from village fires. The crew, those who had survived, would line the rails, silent with relief and exhaustion. They had made it. Not home, not yet, but to the end of the outward journey. And waiting for them was Batavia, the headquarters of the VOC's Eastern Empire, a city that was both familiar and strange, a piece of Holland rebuilt in the tropics, which is where our story travels next. Batavia in the mid-17th century was an oddity, a Dutch city transplanted to the tropics, a place that tried to be Amsterdam and Java simultaneously and was never entirely either. The VOC had seized control of the area in 1619, defeating the local sultanate and establishing a fortified settlement on the ruins of what had been a modest port town. What they built was deliberately European, as if the architecture itself could impose order on the chaos of empire. Picture canals, just like in Amsterdam, straight and carefully maintained, lined with brick warehouses. Picture gabled houses with steep roofs, though the steep roofs made no sense in a climate where snow never fell. Picture a town square with a town hall, churches with Protestant austerity, a fortress with thick walls and cannons pointing toward the sea. The Dutch who governed Batavia wanted to recreate home, wanted to prove that Dutch civilization could flourish anywhere. But Batavia was also an Asian city, and that reality could not be erased by architecture. The majority of the population was not Dutch. There were Javanese and Sundanese, Chinese merchants who formed a community almost as old as the Dutch settlement, slaves brought from across the Indonesian archipelago and from Africa and India. The VOC relied on this diverse population for labour, for local knowledge, for trade connections. Yet it also feared them, imposed strict segregation, and created laws that limited where non-Europeans could live and work. The city was organised with the Dutch at the centre, literally. The inner city within the fortress walls was European space. Here lived the VOC officials, the wealthy merchants, the senior military officers. Their houses had gardens, their offices had views of the canals. Outside the walls in the kampongs lived everyone else. The housing was different here. Lighter structures suited to the climate, palm thatch roofs instead of tile, open walls to let in the breeze. Daily life in Batavia was stratified and complex. The Dutch lived with a strange mixture of abundance and fear. The tropical climate produced fruits and vegetables unknown in Europe. Mangoes and durians and rambutans. The market sold fresh fish and rice and spices at prices no Dutch housewife back home could imagine. But the same climate that produced abundance also produced disease. Malaria was endemic. Dysentery killed newcomers who didn't yet understand what water was safe to drink. The city had a reputation as a graveyard, a place where European life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. Yet people came anyway, drawn by the promise of wealth. A VOC official who survived a posting to the east could return home rich enough to retire in comfort. A merchant who established successful trade connections could make a fortune. Even common soldiers and sailors, if they survived and engaged in a bit of unofficial trading on the side, could accumulate more money than they would ever see in Europe. The mortality rate was the price of that opportunity. The company governed Batavia with the same commercial pragmatism it applied to trade. Laws were created not out of principle but out of necessity. The Governor-General, the highest VOC official in the East, had enormous power but was ultimately accountable to the Heeren 17th back in Amsterdam. He ruled with the help of a council made up of the heads of the various departments. War, trade, justice, finance. Each had its sphere, its bureaucracy, its ledgers and reports. Justice in Batavia was harsh and swift. The VOC needed order to maintain control, and it enforced that order through punishment that was public and brutal. Theft could mean branding or the loss of a hand. Rebellion meant execution. The company kept a gallows permanently erected near the harbour as a reminder. This was not the measured justice of Dutch courts back home. This was colonial law, designed to maintain control through fear. Yet Batavia was also a place of remarkable cultural exchange, even if that exchange was structured by power and inequality. Dutch officials learned Malay, the trade language of the region. They hired local mistresses, had mixed-race children who existed in a social limbo between European and Asian worlds. They adapted to local customs even as they tried to impose their own. Some even grew to prefer the East, found the rigid social hierarchies of Europe stifling compared to the opportunities available in the colonies. The warehouses of Batavia were where the empire's purpose was most visible. Great godowns filled with spices waiting to be shipped west, with porcelain and silk from China, with coffee from Java's highlands. Ships arrived constantly, smaller vessels from across the archipelago bringing goods to be consolidated and shipped to Amsterdam. The organisation required to manage all this, the record-keeping and inventory and scheduling, was impressive in its scope. The VOC was perhaps the first truly global corporation, and Batavia was its operational headquarters. But managing this empire required more than ledgers and warehouses. It required ships that could navigate monsoons and reefs, captains who understood both European seamanship and Asian waters. It required a kind of expertise that was hard-won, learned through experience and sometimes disaster. And it's to those masters of wind and current that we turn our attention now. To sail from Amsterdam to Batavia and back required more than courage. It required knowledge, the kind that came from observation and experience, from charts and careful record-keeping, from understanding the patterns of wind and current that govern the oceans. The Dutch, practical as always, approached navigation as a science to be studied and improved. Not a mystery to be guarded, Consider the problem of latitude. Determining how far north or south you were could be done with relative accuracy using the sun or the stars. A simple device, the cross-staff or backstaff, allowed a navigator to measure the angle of the sun at noon. Combined with tables that showed the sun's position on each day of the year, this gave latitude within a few miles. Dutch navigators carried these tables along with charts that showed the latitudes of ports and landmarks. It was not perfect, but it was good enough. Longitude was harder, much harder. Determining how far east or west you had travelled required knowing the exact time, and keeping accurate time on a ship was nearly impossible. Clocks didn't work. The motion of the ship disrupted their mechanisms. Hourglasses worked but required constant attention and were easily upset. So longitude was estimated through dead reckoning. The navigator kept track of the ship's speed and direction, updating his calculations constantly, trying to account for currents and leeway and all the factors that could push a ship off course. This was more art than science, and it required constant vigilance. A good navigator developed an intuitive feel for the ship and the sea, could sense when the currents were pushing them off course, could read the colour of the water and the behaviour of birds for clues about nearby land. The Dutch trained their navigators systematically, establishing schools in Amsterdam, where young men learned mathematics and astronomy, chart reading, and the use of instruments. These were not mere sailors, but skilled professionals, and their knowledge was valuable enough that the Ivro-Sea paid them well. The charts themselves were remarkable documents. Dutch cartographers in the early 17th century produced maps and sea charts of unprecedented accuracy. They combined information from multiple voyages, compared observations, refined coastlines, and the position of islands. The charts showed not just geography, but practical information for sailors. Where were safe harbours, dangerous reefs, reliable sources of fresh water? What were the patterns of wind and current in different seasons? This knowledge was shared systematically, disseminated through printed charts that were updated regularly. But the most crucial knowledge for sailing to the East Indies was understanding the monsoons. These seasonal winds, which reversed direction with remarkable regularity, governed all travel in the Indian Ocean and the waters around Indonesia. Sail east across the Indian Ocean in the winter when the winds blow from the west. Return in the summer when they blow from the east. Try to sail against the monsoon, and you could spend months making no progress at all, beating endlessly into contrary winds. The Dutch learned to use these patterns with precision. Ships left Batavia for Amsterdam in December or January, riding the southwest monsoon to Ceylon, then catching the westerlies that would carry them around the Cape of Good Hope and back up the Atlantic. They arrived in Amsterdam in July or August, unloaded their cargo, took on new trade goods, and departed again in October or November for the return journey. This annual rhythm became the heartbeat of the VOC's operations. Navigation required not just technical skill, but also mental resilience. A navigator was responsible for the lives of everyone aboard. An error in calculation, a mistake in identifying a landmark, could put the ship on a reef or send it hopelessly off course into unknown waters. The pressure was constant, and yet good navigators learned to trust their knowledge and their judgment. To make decisions calmly even when the situation was desperate. There was also a philosophical dimension to navigation. The navigator dealt in probabilities, not certainties. He could calculate the most likely position of the ship, but he could never be entirely sure. There were too many variables, too many unknowns. Yet decisions still had to be made. When to turn north toward Batavia, whether to risk a shortcut through dangerous waters or take the safer, longer route. The navigator learned to live with uncertainty, to make the best choice he could with imperfect information, and then accept the consequences. This acceptance of uncertainty, this willingness to act despite not knowing everything, characterized the Dutch approach to trade and empire more broadly. They couldn't control all variables, couldn't eliminate all risks. What they could do was gather information, calculate probabilities, and make systematic decisions that, over time, worked more often than they failed, and those decisions, those calculated risks, brought wealth beyond imagination flowing back to Amsterdam. It's to that wealth, and what the Dutch did with it, that we now turn our attention as we enter the third act of our journey. The wealth of empire arrived at the docks, specifically at the VOC warehouses that lined Amsterdam's eastern harbour, massive brick structures with multiple floors and hoists to lift cargo from ships' holds. By the 1620s, these warehouses held goods from across the world. Spices, certainly, but also silk and porcelain, coffee and tea, indigo and sugar. The smell alone must have been extraordinary, all those different cargoes mixing in the air. Consider the scale of operations. The VOC maintained multiple warehouse complexes, each specialised for different types of goods. There were warehouses for spices, kept carefully dry to prevent spoilage. Warehouses for textiles, for fragile porcelain packed in straw, for bulk goods like sugar and coffee. Each warehouse had its staff of clerks and workers, men who spent their days unpacking, sorting, inventorying and storing the physical proof of Dutch commercial dominance. The organisation required was impressive. Every item that came off a VOC ship had to be recorded, its quantity and quality assessed, its ownership determined. Remember, the VOC was a joint stock company with thousands of shareholders. The cargo belonged to all of them, collectively, and had to be accounted for with precision. Clerks filled ledgers with tiny, careful handwriting, tracking every pound of pepper, every bolt of silk, every chest of tea. From the warehouses, goods moved to the auction houses. The VOC sold its imports through regular auctions, carefully staged events where merchants from across Europe came to bid. These auctions were not simple affairs. The company controlled the supply, releasing goods strategically to maintain high prices. If the market seemed soft, they held back inventory. If demand was strong, they released more. It was monopoly management, sophisticated and profitable. The merchants who bought at these auctions were themselves specialists. Some dealt only in spices, others in textiles, others in porcelain or coffee. They had their own warehouses, smaller than the VOC's but still substantial, where they stored goods purchased at auction until they could be sold or shipped elsewhere. These merchants extended credit to each other, creating a web of financial relationships that bound Amsterdam's commercial community together. But the flow of goods didn't stop in Amsterdam. Much of what the VOC imported was re-exported, sold to merchants in other European cities. Amsterdam became a distribution centre, the place where exotic goods from the east were funneled to markets across the continent. Pepper purchased in Indonesia, shipped to Amsterdam, might end up in the markets of London or Paris or Hamburg. Each transaction adding a margin of profit. This re-export trade required excellent infrastructure. Amsterdam's harbour could accommodate dozens of large ships simultaneously. The canal system allowed goods to be moved efficiently throughout the city. The city had shipyards to build and repair vessels, rope makers and sail makers, coopers who made the barrels for storing cargo. All of these trades depended on the flow of goods through the VOC warehouses. The financial flows were equally complex. When the VOC ships returned from the east, the company paid dividends to shareholders. These dividends, in the prosperous years of the early and mid-17th century, could be substantial, sometimes 20 or 30% of the original investment in a single year. But shareholders didn't just take their money and spend it. They reinvested, either buying more VOC shares or funding other commercial ventures. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, founded in 1609, helped facilitate all this commerce. It allowed merchants to settle accounts without moving physical coins, maintaining balances that could be transferred with a simple ledger entry. This made large transactions easier and safer. It also created something like modern banking, where money existed more as numbers in books than as gold and silver in vaults. The concentration of wealth this created was remarkable. Amsterdam in the mid-17th century was probably the wealthiest city in Europe, perhaps in the world. The richest merchants lived in houses along the Grand Canals, structures of elegant brick with large windows and elaborate gables. They commissioned portraits from the finest painters, bought furniture from the best craftsmen, ate off porcelain from China and drank wine from France. But the wealth wasn't entirely concentrated among the richest. The commercial boom created employment for thousands. Warehouse workers, sailors, shipbuilders, clerks all earned wages that, while modest compared to merchant fortunes, were better than what they could earn elsewhere. Amsterdam attracted immigrants from across Europe, people seeking economic opportunity in a city where work was plentiful and social mobility was possible. Yet there was fragility in this system, though perhaps it wasn't obvious at the time. The wealth depended on the continued flow of goods from the East, on the VOC maintaining its monopoly, on European demand for Asian luxuries continuing to grow. Any disruption to this flow could have consequences, but in the 1620s and 30s, such disruptions seemed distant possibilities. The system worked, the wealth accumulated, and Amsterdam thrived. And the men who managed all this, who made the calculations and decisions that governed the flow of goods and money, had their own particular culture, their own way of understanding the world. It's to these merchants and their ledgers that we now turn our attention. There's a painting by Rembrandt, the Syndics of the Drapers' Guild, that shows 5 men and a servant seated at a table covered with fabric. The men wear black clothing, white collars, broad-brimmed hats. They're looking at something, perhaps account books, perhaps towards someone who has entered the room. The painting is calm, dignified, serious. These are not aristocrats. They're merchants, businessmen, members of a guild that regulated the cloth trade, and Rembrandt painted them with the same care and respect he might paint nobility. This was the visual language of the Dutch merchant class. Sober black clothing, careful grooming, an air of competence and responsibility. The merchant's world was one of numbers and contracts, of reputation and trust. Appearance mattered, not for ostentation, but to signal reliability. You wanted people to believe you would honour your commitments, that you were prudent and trustworthy. Flashy displays of wealth were considered vulgar, a sign of poor judgment. The heart of a merchant's business was his counting house, a room in his home or warehouse where the books were kept. Here, the merchant and his clerks maintained accounts, recording every transaction with careful precision. Double-entry bookkeeping, which had developed in Italy during the Renaissance, was standard practice among Dutch merchants by the 17th century. Every transaction was recorded twice, as a credit and a debit, creating a system of checks that helped prevent errors and fraud. The ledgers themselves were works of art in their way. Bound volumes with marbled covers, pages filled with columns of numbers, all written in the same careful hand. Each entry noted the date, the parties involved, the goods or money exchanged, the terms of the agreement. A merchant could open his ledger and trace the history of his business transactions, see at a glance who owed him money and whom he owed. These books were valuable, were protected carefully, were sometimes the most valuable thing a merchant owned aside from his actual inventory. But beyond the technical skill of bookkeeping was a particular mindset, a way of understanding the world. Merchants thought in terms of profit and loss, risk and reward, probabilities and possibilities. Every decision was a calculation. Should you extend credit to this buyer? The potential profit had to be weighed against the risk that they might default. Should you invest in a particular voyage? The possible return had to justify the chance that the ship might be lost. This calculative mindset extended beyond business into daily life. Merchants were famous for their frugality, not because they lacked money, but because they saw waste as irrational. Why spend more than necessary? Why pay for ostentation when the same function could be achieved more cheaply? This was not meanness, but efficiency. The same principle that governed the design of the Floyd applied to personal consumption. Yet there was also a culture of trust and mutual obligation among merchants. Amsterdam's commercial community was relatively small, at least at the upper levels. The wealthiest merchants all knew each other, sat on the same boards and committees, worshipped in the same churches, married into each other's families. Reputation in this community was everything. A merchant who defaulted on his obligations, who lied or cheated, would find himself excluded from future deals. Trust, once lost, was nearly impossible to regain. This created a kind of informal regulation. Merchants policed each other's behaviour not through formal law but through social pressure and economic consequence. Guilds helped enforce standards, but even more important was the simple fact that dishonest dealing was bad for business. The Dutch commercial system worked because the participants believed they could trust each other to honour contracts, to deliver goods of the promised quality, to pay debts when they came due. The merchant's day followed a predictable rhythm. Mornings were for business, meeting with partners and clients, reviewing accounts, making decisions about purchases and sales. Midday brought a simple meal, nothing elaborate, eaten quickly. Afternoons were for correspondence, for writing letters to trading partners in other cities, for reading letters received. The mail was vital, the primary way of coordinating trade across distances. A merchant in Amsterdam might have regular correspondence in London, Hamburg, Venice, Batavia, all keeping him informed of prices and opportunities. Evenings could be for family and social obligations, but even these had commercial dimensions. Dinners with fellow merchants were opportunities to discuss business, to share information, to form partnerships. The line between social and commercial life was blurry. Your friends were likely your business partners, your family connections often determined your commercial opportunities. The merchant's wife played a role as well, though it was often invisible in the official records. She managed the household, certainly, but in many merchant families the wife also kept some of the books, managed correspondence, even negotiated deals when her husband was away. Merchant culture valued practical competence over rigid gender roles, at least within the family business. A clever wife who could manage accounts was an asset, and many merchants trained their daughters in basic bookkeeping and commercial arithmetic. What emerges from all this is a picture of a particular kind of capitalism, commercial but not industrial, sophisticated but not yet modern. The Dutch merchant of the 17th century was creating the tools and practices that would later define capitalism. Joint stock companies, modern banking, international trade networks, systematic accounting. But he was doing this within a context that still valued community and reputation, that balanced profit-seeking with social obligation. It was a moment of transition, and Amsterdam was at its centre. And this accumulation of wealth, this careful calculating culture, produced something unexpected. It produced art. Not just any art, but a flowering of painting that would define the era. And it's to those paintings and the extraordinary artist who created them that we now turn our attention. Rembrandt van Rijn was 36 years old when he painted the Night Watch in 1642, at the height of his fame and skill. The painting is enormous, more than 3 meters tall and 4 meters wide, showing members of a civic militia company in dramatic, dynamic composition. But what's remarkable, what makes it a masterpiece rather than just a very large group portrait, is the light. Light pours into the painting from the left, illuminating the two central figures in brilliant clarity, while leaving others in shadow. It's theatrical, artificial, not the flat, even lighting you'd expect from a group portrait, but it makes the painting alive, dynamic, transforms what could have been a static lineup into something that looks like a moment captured mid-motion. This is what Rembrandt understood better than almost any painter before or since. Light could be a subject itself, could create drama and emotion, could transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. The Dutch Golden Age produced more paintings than perhaps any period in history before it. Not just masterpieces, though there were plenty of those, but thousands upon thousands of competent professional works, landscapes and seascapes, portraits and still lifes, genre scenes showing daily life in kitchens and taverns. Painting in the Dutch Republic was not just an art but an industry, with painters working in studios that sometimes resembled small factories, producing works for a market that seemed to have an inexhaustible appetite. Part of this was economics. The Dutch Republic was wealthy enough that even middle-class families could afford paintings. Not Rembrandt's, certainly, but works by competent professionals. Having paintings on your walls was a way of demonstrating cultural refinement, of participating in the broader culture of the Golden Age. So there was a market, and painters rose to meet it. But there was also something about Dutch culture that valued visual art in particular ways. The Protestant Reformation had stripped the churches of their elaborate decorations, their paintings and statues. Religious art, which had been a major source of patronage for artists elsewhere in Europe, was no longer in demand. This could have been disastrous for Dutch painters, but instead, it liberated them to explore other subjects. They painted the world around them with remarkable attention and honesty. Johannes Vermeer, working in Delft, painted domestic interiors with such precision that you can almost hear the silence in rooms where a woman reads a letter or pours milk. These are not grand historical or religious scenes, just ordinary moments rendered with extraordinary care. The light in Vermeer's paintings, like Rembrandt's but quieter, more contemplative, transforms the mundane into the profound. Still life painting became its own sophisticated genre. Artists painted tables laden with food, flowers in vases, musical instruments, books, all rendered with meticulous detail. But these paintings were not just decorative. They were loaded with symbolism, with references to the transience of life, the vanity of earthly pleasures. A beautiful flower beginning to wilt, a watch reminding the viewer that time passes, bread and wine suggesting communion. These paintings asked viewers to contemplate mortality and meaning, while also simply appreciating the skill with which a droplet of water on a grape was rendered. Landscape painting evolved into something distinctly Dutch. The landscape of the Netherlands is not dramatic. There are no mountains or dramatic vistas, just flat land, wide skies, and water. But Dutch painters found beauty in this. They painted the play of clouds across enormous skies, the way light reflected off water, windmills turning in the distance. These paintings celebrated the ordinary Dutch landscape, found dignity and beauty in the land their ancestors had literally created through drainage and dike building. The painters themselves were mostly professionals, not struggling bohemians. They joined guilds, served as respected members of their communities, often had other business interests. Vermeer's father was an art dealer and innkeeper. Many painters supplemented their income from painting with other work, teaching or dealing in art or running other businesses. Painting was a profession, sometimes a good living, though only the most successful, like Rembrandt during his peak years, became truly wealthy. The studios where these paintings were created were places of practical craft as well as artistry. Apprentices learned by grinding pigments, stretching canvases, copying masterworks. They learned the technical skills, how to mix colours, how to build up layers of paint, how to create the illusion of texture and depth. Only after years of training would they be allowed to create their own compositions and eventually become masters themselves. The paintings that emerge from this system are remarkable for their technical excellence. The Dutch mastered oil painting, understanding how to layer transparent glazes to create depth and luminosity, how to use thick impasto for texture, how to blend colours seamlessly or leave visible brushstrokes for effect. They understood how light worked, how to paint reflective surfaces, translucent fabrics, the subtle gradations of shadow. But beyond technique was something harder to define. The best Dutch paintings have a particular quality, a sense of stillness and contemplation, a feeling that the artist has looked at the world with extraordinary attention and invited the viewer to do the same. They don't shout or demand. They wait patiently for you to look, to notice the details, to appreciate the care that went into every square inch of canvas. And perhaps this reflected something about Dutch culture more broadly. The same attention to detail that characterised merchant bookkeeping and ship design found its expression in painting, the same appreciation for the material world, for the things you could see and touch and measure, translated into art that celebrated visible reality with profound respect. The Dutch painted their world because they valued it, found it sufficient and worthy of care. This golden age of painting would not last. By the end of the century, tastes would change, the market would contract, and Dutch painting would fade from its height. But the works themselves endured, and they remain perhaps the most accessible legacy of the Golden Age. You can visit a museum and stand before a Rembrandt or Vermeer and see exactly what someone in 17th century Amsterdam saw, the same light and shadow, the same careful observation of the world. In that sense, the paintings are time machines, preserving not just images but a way of seeing. But the Golden Age produced more than art. It produced knowledge, systematic and shared. And it's to the scholars and mapmakers who expanded the boundaries of human understanding that we now turn our attention. In 1633, René Descartes moved to Amsterdam. He was already a brilliant mathematician and philosopher, but he chose to live in the Dutch Republic because of its intellectual freedom. Here he could think and write without the kind of censorship that would have been inevitable in France or most other European countries. The Dutch Republic, with its tradition of religious tolerance and its commercial pragmatism, had become a haven for scholars and intellectuals from across Europe. The University of Leiden, founded in 1575 as a reward to the city for its resistance during the Spanish siege, had become one of Europe's leading institutions of learning. Students came from across the continent to study theology, law, medicine, natural philosophy. The university collected books, building a library that became one of the finest in Europe. It established a botanical garden where exotic plants from the East Indies could be studied. It attracted professors who were leaders in their fields. But intellectual life in the Dutch Republic was not confined to universities. Amsterdam had no university until much later, but it was nevertheless a centre of learning. Publishers in Amsterdam produced books in multiple languages, works that might be banned elsewhere, works of philosophy and natural science, religious texts that challenged orthodox views, political treatises that questioned absolute monarchy. The Dutch commitment to relatively free press made Amsterdam the publishing capital of Europe. Consider the maps. Dutch cartographers in the 17th century created maps and atlases of unprecedented accuracy and beauty. The Blaeu family, mapmakers and publishers in Amsterdam, produced massive atlases that were prized across Europe. These were not just functional documents but works of art, with elaborate decorative cartouches, sea monsters in the oceans, careful hand colouring. The maps combined information from Dutch trading voyages with the latest geographical knowledge, and they were constantly updated as new discoveries were made. The motivation for cartography was partly commercial. Accurate maps were valuable to merchants and ship captains, but there was also pure intellectual curiosity, a desire to understand and represent the world as it truly was. Dutch mapmakers corresponded with explorers and navigators, collected reports from VOC captains, synthesized information from multiple sources. They developed new projection methods to represent the spherical Earth on flat paper, calculated coordinates with increasing precision. Natural philosophy, what we would call science, flourished in this environment. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a draper in Delft with no formal education, taught himself to grind lenses of remarkable quality and built microscopes that revealed a previously invisible world. He observed bacteria, saw blood cells for the first time, described the structure of muscle fibres and plant tissues. He corresponded with the Royal Society in London, sharing his observations, contributing to the collective project of understanding nature. This was characteristic of Dutch intellectual culture: practical, observational, willing to trust evidence over authority. Van Leeuwenhoek didn't need a university degree to contribute to knowledge. He needed curiosity, skill, and patience. The same empirical mindset that governed trade, the careful recording of observations and the willingness to update beliefs based on new information applied to natural philosophy. The Dutch also excelled at collaborative scholarship. Learned societies brought together men interested in various subjects: natural philosophy and mathematics, literature and history. They met to discuss ideas, to share observations, to critique each other's work. This created a culture where knowledge advanced through conversation and debate, rather than being handed down from authorities. Hugo Grotius, perhaps the greatest Dutch legal scholar of the age, developed ideas about natural law and international law that would influence legal thinking for centuries. His work, Mare Liberum, The Free Sea, argued that the oceans could not be owned by any nation but were common to all. This was partly self-interest. The VOC wanted to challenge Portuguese claims to monopoly over Indian Ocean trade, but Grotius grounded his argument in philosophical principles about natural rights and common resources. The practical and the philosophical intertwined. Religious scholarship also flourished, though here the picture was more complicated. The Dutch Republic was officially Calvinist, but it tolerated other faiths to a degree unusual in 17th century Europe. Catholics could worship, though not publicly. Jews, expelled from Spain and Portugal, found refuge in Amsterdam and established a vibrant community. Philosophers and theologians debated questions of free will and predestination, the relationship between faith and reason, the proper interpretation of Scripture. Baruch Spinoza, a Jewish philosopher in Amsterdam, pushed these questions to their limits. His philosophy, De Aand, which questioned traditional religious beliefs and proposed a kind of pantheistic understanding of God and nature, was controversial enough to get him expelled from the Jewish community. But he could continue to live and work in Amsterdam, writing and corresponding with other philosophers. In most of Europe, his ideas would have led to imprisonment or worse. What united all these intellectual pursuits was a commitment to observation and reason over received authority. The Dutch scholars and mapmakers, whether university professors or self-taught lens grinders, believed that knowledge came from careful study of the world, not from simply accepting what ancient texts or church authorities claimed. This was not atheism or irreligion. Most of these men were sincerely religious. But it was a willingness to question, to test, to verify, and this intellectual culture was supported by the prosperity of the Golden Age. Wealthy merchants patronized scholars, bought books and maps and scientific instruments. The same economic system that brought spices from the Indies also brought ideas from across the world, creating an environment where knowledge could grow and flourish. But prosperity, as the Dutch would learn, can be as fragile as a soap bubble, as transient as tulip bloom, and it's to one of the most famous episodes of the Golden Age, an episode that revealed both the possibilities and dangers of their commercial system, that we now turn our attention. The tulip had come to Europe from Turkey, a flower prized for its bright colours and elegant shape. In the Dutch Republic of the early 17th century, tulips became more than flowers. They became objects of speculation, investment vehicles, symbols of wealth and status. And for a few remarkable months in 1636 and 37, they drove what might have been the first financial bubble in modern history. It started reasonably enough. Tulips were genuinely rare and beautiful. The most prized varieties, those with flame-like patterns of colour caused by a virus that affected the pigmentation, were difficult to cultivate. A single bulb of a rare variety might sell for a substantial sum, a few hundred guilders perhaps, expensive but not absurd. Wealthy merchants and collectors competed to have the finest specimens, and this demand drove prices up. But tulip bulbs have a particular characteristic that made them perfect for speculation. They can only be planted in autumn, and they only bloom in spring. For most of the year the bulbs are dormant, stored away. This meant that during the summer and winter, you couldn't actually see what you were buying. You were buying a promise, a piece of paper that said you owned a tulip bulb that would be delivered at the end of the growing season. These promises, these contracts for future delivery, began to be traded. Someone who had contracted to buy a bulb in autumn might sell that contract to someone else before the bulb was actually delivered, and that person might sell it again. The contracts became separated from the physical bulbs, took on a life of their own. The market for tulip contracts grew, drawing in not just wealthy collectors but ordinary people looking to make money through speculation. Prices began to rise rapidly. A bulb that might have cost 100 guilders one month could be worth 200 the next, 400 the month after that. People saw their neighbours getting rich from tulip trading and wanted to participate. They borrowed money to buy contracts, betting that prices would continue to rise. And as long as prices did rise, as long as there were always new buyers willing to pay more, the system worked. The peak came in early 1637. Some contracts for rare tulip bulbs sold for prices that seem almost incomprehensible. 10,000 guilders for a single bulb, more than a skilled craftsman might earn in a decade. Stories circulated, probably exaggerated, of bulbs selling for the price of a house or a ship. The market had become completely detached from any rational assessment of what a flower bulb was actually worth. And then, almost as suddenly as it had risen, the market collapsed. In February 1637, buyers simply stopped appearing. Someone tried to sell a contract and found no one willing to buy at the inflated price. They lowered the price, and still no buyers appeared. Panic set in. People who had borrowed money to buy contracts now held worthless pieces of paper. Creditors demanded payment. Fortunes that had existed only on paper evaporated. The collapse of tulip mania did not destroy the Dutch economy. Most of the really serious speculation had been among a relatively small group, and most transactions had been for future delivery, meaning people had not yet actually exchanged the full purchase price. But it was a shock. A reminder of the dangers of speculation, of how quickly paper wealth could disappear. What's interesting is how the Dutch responded. There was no government bailout, no attempt to artificially prop up tulip prices. The courts generally declined to enforce the more absurd contracts, ruling that they were gambling debts rather than legitimate commercial obligations. People who had lost money in tulip speculation simply had to absorb their losses. The market sorted itself out. But the episode revealed something about human nature and about the commercial system the Dutch had created. When money could be made easily through speculation, when paper contracts could be traded without limit, when prices could rise simply because everyone believed they would continue to rise, bubbles could form. The rational calculation that normally governed Dutch commerce could be overwhelmed by greed and fear, by the human tendency to believe that this time was different, that prices could rise forever. Tulip mania became a cautionary tale, referenced by moralists as an example of vanity and folly. Artists painted still lifes featuring tulips as symbols of transience and the dangers of earthly desire. But the speculation itself, the fundamental dynamic of buying low and selling high, of trading contracts and futures, these became permanent features of Dutch commercial life. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, where shares in the VOC and other companies traded, operated on similar principles and would see its own bubbles and crashes in the years to come. What tulip mania demonstrated was both the power and the fragility of the financial system the Dutch had created. Money could be made from nothing, from buying and selling pieces of paper that represented future obligations. This was useful. It allowed capital to flow efficiently to where it was needed. But it also created opportunities for instability, for wealth to appear and disappear based on nothing more substantial than collective belief. And yet life went on. The tulip still bloomed each spring, beautiful and indifferent to human folly. The merchants still kept their ledgers, the ships still sailed to the Indies, the painters still captured light on canvas. The Golden Age continued, though perhaps with a slightly more sober understanding of the risks inherent in their prosperity. And it's to the daily reality of that prosperity, to how ordinary people lived during this extraordinary time, that we now turn our attention as we enter the fourth act of our journey. Let's imagine a day in the life of an ordinary burgher, a moderately successful merchant in Amsterdam in the 1640s. His name is Peter, which is common enough, and he lives in a narrow house on one of the smaller canals, not the grand Herengracht where the wealthiest merchants live, but respectable enough. The house is 4 stories tall, as most Amsterdam houses are, narrow-fronted to minimise the property taxes that were based on street frontage but deep, extending back from the canal. Peter wakes early, as merchants do, just after dawn. His bedroom is on the 3rd floor, modestly furnished with a bed, a chest for clothes, perhaps a chair. The walls are whitewashed plaster, clean and simple. There might be one painting, something modest, a landscape or a still life, purchased from a local artist. Peter dresses himself, there's no servant for that, in dark woolen breeches and doublet, white linen shirt and collar, wool stockings. The clothing is good quality but not flashy, appropriate to his station. Downstairs, his wife Marieke has already started the day's work. She's arranged breakfast on the table in the voorhuis, the front room that serves as both living space and reception area for business guests. Breakfast is simple, bread and butter, cheese, perhaps some dried fish, all washed down with beer. The water in Amsterdam is not entirely safe to drink, so beer, which has been boiled during brewing, is the standard beverage even for breakfast. After eating, Peter descends another floor to his counting house. A room at the ground level looking out onto the canal. Here are his desk and ledgers, his scales for weighing coins, his samples of cloth and spices. This is where he conducts business, meeting with other merchants, examining goods, negotiating deals, recording transactions. The room smells of ink and paper, tobacco smoke from his pipe, the faint scent of exotic goods stored in the warehouse attached to the back of the house. This morning, he's expecting a visit from a merchant who owes him money from a transaction several months past. The debt is not large, a few hundred guilders, but it's overdue and Peter needs the money to pay his own creditors. When the man arrives, they greet each other formally but without excessive ceremony. They discuss the debt. The other merchant apologises for the delay, explains that his own debtors have been slow to pay. They negotiate and eventually the man pays part of what he owes, with a promise to pay the rest within the month. Peter records this in his ledger. Careful notation in neat handwriting. Trust is important, but records are essential. The morning continues with other business. A letter has arrived from a correspondent in Hamburg, reporting on prices there for spices and textiles. Peter reads it carefully, considers whether there's an opportunity to buy in Amsterdam and ship to Hamburg for a profit. He drafts a reply, discussing possibilities, asking for more details about market conditions. The letter will go on the next ship to Hamburg, and he'll wait weeks for a response. Long-distance trade requires patience. Around midday, the family gathers for the main meal. Peter and Marieke, their 3 children, perhaps Peter's elderly mother who lives on the top floor. The meal is substantial but not elaborate. Bread, a thick soup or stew, vegetables, fish, or occasionally meat. The Dutch diet is hearty rather than refined, fuel for work rather than an indulgence. After eating, there's a brief rest, perhaps an hour, before the afternoon's work begins. Afternoons are often for physical inspection of goods. Peter goes to the warehouse attached to his house to check inventory. There are barrels of dried fish, bales of cloth from Leiden, sacks of grain. He's planning a shipment to the Baltic and needs to ensure the quality is acceptable. He examines samples, makes notes, calculates weights and values. This is not glamorous work, but it's essential. A merchant's reputation depends on delivering quality goods, on being reliable. Later in the afternoon, Peter might walk to the exchange, the Beurs, where merchants gather to trade and gossip and make deals. This is partly social, partly business. He learns what goods are selling well, what prices are rising or falling, what ships have arrived or are expected. He runs into an old friend and they arrange to meet for a pipe and conversation at a tavern later in the week. Business and social life are inseparable. Returning home in the early evening, Peter has supper with his family, a lighter meal than midday, perhaps bread and cheese, fruit if it's available. After supper, he might spend time with the children, listening to them recite lessons. They're learning to read and do basic arithmetic, essential skills for the next generation. Or he might return to his counting house to work on his books, balancing accounts, planning future ventures. Before bed, the family gathers for evening prayers. Peter is reformed, as most Dutch burghers are, and while he's not fanatically religious, he observes the expected practices. Prayer is brief, sincere but formulaic, asking for God's blessing on the household and business, then to bed, to sleep in the narrow house on the small canal, to rest before another day of work and calculation, negotiation and record-keeping. This is not a dramatic life. There are no great events, no crises or triumphs in a single day. But multiply this day by thousands of merchants, thousands of counting houses, and you begin to understand how the Golden Age worked. It was built on routine, on small transactions carefully recorded, on trust maintained through daily interaction, on work done well and consistently. The wealth of Amsterdam was the accumulated result of 10,000 Peters keeping their ledgers and paying their debts and inspecting their warehouses. And the city those Peters inhabited was itself a kind of miracle, a built environment that reflected their values and ambitions. Which is where we turn our attention next. Stand on a bridge in the Jordan district of Amsterdam today, and you're looking at a landscape created in the 17th century. The canals form concentric half circles, following the old city walls that were torn down and replaced by broader waterways during the Great Expansion that began in 1613. The houses lining those canals are narrow and tall, built of brick with distinctive gables that identified both their age and their style. This is the physical legacy of the Golden Age, stone and water arranged according to careful plans, creating a city that was functional and beautiful in equal measure. The expansion plan was ambitious in scope. Amsterdam had grown rapidly in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, swollen with refugees from the Spanish Netherlands and immigrants seeking opportunity. The old medieval city was overcrowded, the housing inadequate. The city government decided to solve this through systematic expansion, adding 3 major canals, the Herengracht, Keizersgracht and Prinsengracht, that would encircle the old city and create new building lots. But this was not haphazard growth. City planners drew detailed maps specifying exactly where the canals would run, how wide they would be, where the streets would connect them. They specified the width of building lots, the setback requirements, even the types of trees that would be planted along the canal banks. This was urban planning on a scale Europe had not seen since Roman times, creating not just individual buildings but an integrated urban landscape. The lots along the Herengracht, the Gentleman's Canal, were the most expensive, reserved for the wealthiest merchants. Here the houses are grandest, 4 or 5 stories tall, with elaborate gables, large windows, and facades of expensive imported stone rather than brick. The merchants who built these houses were making statements about their success, their taste, their position in Amsterdam society. But even these grand houses were built to common standards, maintaining a visual harmony along the canal. The building process itself was an engineering challenge. Amsterdam sits on soft ground, peat and clay, that cannot support heavy stone buildings without preparation. So before construction could begin, workers had to drive wooden piles deep into the ground until they reached a more stable layer of sand. A large house might require dozens or even hundreds of these piles, each one driven by hand using a weighted ram. This was laborious. Expensive work, but it was necessary. Without proper foundations, the buildings would simply sink into the soft ground. Once the piles were in place, construction could proceed. Amsterdam architecture developed a distinctive style during the Golden Age. The houses were narrow because lots were narrow, but they extended deep into the block. The front facade was the public face, often elaborately decorated, while the sides and back were simpler. The gable at the top of the facade served both aesthetic and practical purposes. It hid the steeply pitched roof and provided a point for the pulley system used to hoist furniture and goods to the upper floors. Those pulleys, which you can still see on Amsterdam houses today, were necessary because the staircases were too narrow and steep to move large items up and down. Instead, goods and furniture were hoisted through windows that could be opened wide. This was part of the design, the integration of commercial and residential function. Many of these houses had warehouses on the ground floor or in an attached building at the back, and the upper floors were living space. The interiors of these houses reflected Dutch values of comfort and practicality. Rooms were smaller than in the grand palaces elsewhere in Europe, but they were well lit, thanks to large windows. The Dutch made excellent window glass and they used it generously, creating bright interiors even in a climate where sunshine was not guaranteed. The floors were typically tiled, easy to keep clean, which mattered in a muddy city where cleanliness was prized. Furniture was solid and well made but not excessively ornate. Tables and chairs of dark wood, cabinets for storing linens and silver, beds with heavy curtains that could be drawn for warmth and privacy. The Dutch invented or perfected several furniture forms, including the linen press and the cabinet on stand, pieces that were both functional and beautiful, and the walls were decorated with paintings, those affordable works we discussed earlier, creating gallery-like spaces in ordinary homes. But the canals were more than just pretty waterways lined with houses. They were functional, part of the city's transportation and commerce. Boats moved goods from warehouses to ships in the harbour. Smaller craft ferried people across the city. The canals were also part of the water management system, helping to drain excess water and prevent flooding. Amsterdam was a machine, carefully designed, every element serving multiple purposes. The bridges that crossed the canals were works of engineering and art. Stone or brick arches, some decorated with sculptures, all designed to allow boat traffic to pass underneath while providing pedestrian and cart traffic to cross above. At night, the bridges and canal banks were lit with oil lamps, making Amsterdam one of the first cities in Europe with anything like street lighting. Walking through this city at its height, you would have been struck by the sense of order and prosperity. Clean streets, well-maintained buildings, busy commerce conducted with efficiency. This was not the chaotic medieval city of narrow alleys and uncertain property lines, but a modern city, planned and organised, reflecting the values of the merchants who governed it. Everything had its place, its purpose, its carefully calculated reason for being. And yet there was also beauty. Not the grand beauty of royal palaces or cathedrals, but a quieter beauty born from proportion and care. The way the houses reflected in the still water of the canals, the pattern of brick laid in careful courses, the elegance of a well-designed gable. The Dutch created a city that was both engine of commerce and work of art, and that city still stands, still beautiful, still functional, centuries after the Golden Age ended. But the same forces that created this prosperity, the same commercial empire that funded these canals and houses, carried within them complexities and contradictions, moral weight that the Dutch of the time struggled to fully acknowledge. And it's to those harder truths that we must now turn our attention. The prosperity of the Golden Age was not built on commerce alone. It was also built on violence, on naval power deployed ruthlessly to establish and maintain monopolies, on wars fought thousands of kilometres from Amsterdam in waters most Dutch citizens would never see. The VOC was not just a trading company. It was a military power, commanding dozens of armed ships and thousands of soldiers, fighting campaigns across maritime Asia. Consider the Anglo-Dutch Wars, a series of conflicts between the Dutch Republic and England in the mid to late 17th century. These were not wars of conquest or religion, but wars of trade, fought over commercial supremacy, fishing rights, control of maritime routes. The first of these wars broke out in 1652, triggered partly by English resentment of Dutch dominance in carrying trade, partly by specific incidents involving Dutch ships refusing to salute English flags. The wars were fought primarily at sea, with fleets of heavily armed ships engaging in close-range combat. These were brutal affairs. Ships exchanged broadsides at close range, wooden hulls splintered by cannon fire, decks slick with blood. The Dutch, despite their commercial success, proved to be formidable naval powers. Admirals like Martin Tromp and Michel de Ruyter became national heroes, celebrated for their skill and courage in battle. But these European wars, significant as they were almost secondary to the conflicts the VOC fought in Asian waters. Here, the company waged war for purely commercial reasons, to eliminate competition, to force local rulers to accept Dutch monopolies on certain goods, to punish resistance to VOC authority. These were colonial wars, though that term had not yet acquired all its later meanings. The conquest of the Banda Islands in the 1620s was perhaps the most extreme example. These small islands in the Moluccas were the world's only source of nutmeg, and the local population had long traded with various merchants, including Portuguese, English, and Dutch. The VOC wanted exclusive control. When the Bandanese resisted, the company responded with overwhelming force. Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen led an expedition that systematically destroyed resistance, killing thousands, enslaving others, depopulating entire islands. The survivors were replaced with Dutch planters and enslaved labourers brought from elsewhere in the archipelago. The nutmeg groves were placed under strict VOC control, and any attempts to smuggle seeds or plants were punished severely. This was monopoly capitalism at its most brutal, the extermination of a population to secure control of a commodity. The VOC also engaged in regular warfare with local kingdoms that challenged its authority, wars in Java, in Ceylon, in Malabar. These campaigns involved fortifications besieged, armies marching through jungles, naval engagements in tropical harbours. The company maintained permanent garrisons across its territories, thousands of soldiers, many of them European, but many also recruited locally or from other parts of Asia. These soldiers fought in the VOC's commercial interest, received modest wages, and died in large numbers from disease and combat. The human cost of these wars was enormous and mostly invisible to people in Amsterdam. Soldiers and sailors who never returned, local populations displaced or destroyed, societies disrupted by the imposition of Dutch commercial control. The VOC maintained its monopolies through force, and that force was applied without hesitation when profits were at stake. There was also the matter of slavery. The VOC was not primarily a slave trading company like those that would later operate in the Atlantic, but it used enslaved labour extensively in its Asian territories. Slaves worked on VOC plantations in fortifications as domestic servants for company officials. They were bought, sold, transported across the Indian Ocean, treated as property. This was accepted practice in the 17th century, rationalised by both commercial necessity and prevailing racial and religious ideologies. Back in Amsterdam, most people were aware of these realities in only the most abstract sense. They knew the VOC maintained fortifications and fought wars. That was part of what their investment funded, but the details were distant. Filtered through official reports that emphasised commercial success rather than human cost. The violence happened elsewhere, committed by other people, against populations who seemed utterly remote from Dutch experience. Yet there were voices of concern even then. Some questioned whether it was right to wage war for commerce, whether Christian principles were compatible with the brutal enforcement of trade monopolies. Hugo Grotius, the legal scholar, argued for a law of nations that would regulate warfare and protect non-combatants. But these were minority voices, easily ignored when the dividends from the VOC continued to flow. What we see looking back is the fundamental tension at the heart of the Dutch Golden Age. It was built on principles of republicanism and tolerance, on systematic rationality and careful calculation, on a kind of commercial ethics that valued trust and honesty in dealings. But it was also built on violence and exploitation, on the willingness to use force to maintain profitable monopolies, on systems of slavery and indentured labour, on the dispossession and sometimes extermination of peoples who stood in the way of commercial interests. This tension was not unique to the Dutch. Every European commercial empire of the age faced similar contradictions. But it was perhaps particularly stark in the Dutch case because of their republican values and their self-image as a reasonable moderate people. The same merchants who kept meticulous books and attended church regularly profited from ventures that involved slavery and conquest, and most seem to have felt no contradiction. Understanding this requires neither excusing the violence nor simply condemning it from our modern perspective, but recognizing it as part of the full reality of the Golden Age. The prosperity was real. The achievements in art and architecture and commerce were genuine, but they rested on foundations that included exploitation and violence. Both truths can exist simultaneously, must exist simultaneously if we are to understand the period honestly. And it's with that honesty about complexity that we now turn to examine how this extraordinary period began to fade, how the conditions that created the Golden Age eventually shifted, bringing not dramatic collapse but slow decline. By the late 17th century, cracks were appearing in the structure of Dutch commercial dominance. Not dramatic fractures, not sudden crises, but subtle shifts in the balance of power and trade that would, over time, erode the position the Dutch had worked so hard to establish. Understanding this decline requires understanding both external challenges and internal limitations, the ways that success itself created new problems. The English and French, having learned from Dutch methods, were building their own commercial empires. England's Navigation Acts, first passed in 1651, required that goods imported to England be carried on English ships, or ships from the country of origin. This was aimed directly at Dutch dominance of carrying trade. If Baltic grain couldn't be carried to England on Dutch ships, that was a significant loss of business. The Dutch protested, went to war over it, but could not ultimately prevent England from implementing policies that favoured English shipping. France, under Louis XIV, pursued similar policies. High tariffs on Dutch goods, prohibitions on certain types of trade, support for French trading companies designed to compete with the VOC. The French state actively worked to build a commercial empire that could rival the Dutch, and they had resources the Dutch Republic couldn't match. France was larger, had a bigger population, could mobilise more soldiers and ships when needed. The VOC itself, despite continued profitability, was beginning to show signs of strain. The easy profits from monopolising spices were no longer as easy. Competition from the English East India Company, which operated from bases in India, meant that the VOC had to work harder to maintain its position. The company expanded into new goods, coffee and tea and silk, but these required different trading patterns, different relationships with Asian producers. The administrative structure of the VOC, which had been innovative in 1600, was becoming ossified by 1700. The company was huge, employed thousands of people, operated across vast distances. Corruption was a constant problem. Company officials in the East, far from supervision, engaged in private trading that competed with the VOC's own operations. Ships' captains sold cargo they were supposed to deliver to the company. Warehouse managers accepted bribes to look the other way when goods were stolen. The company tried to control this through regulations and audits, through appointing inspectors and punishing offenders, but the problem was structural. How could Amsterdam effectively supervise operations in Jakarta or Malacca when communication took a year and decisions had to be made on the spot? The very geographical reach that made the VOC powerful also made it difficult to manage. There was also the question of military costs. Maintaining fortifications across Asia, keeping permanent garrisons, building and arming ships, all of this was expensive. The VOC had to be both a commercial and a military organisation, and the military functions consumed resources that might otherwise have gone to shareholders as dividends. As competition increased, the company had to spend more on defence and less was available for profit. Domestically, the Dutch Republic faced challenges as well. The political system, which had worked through consensus and compromise, became more fractious. Conflicts between provinces, between Orangists who supported a strong stadtholder and Republicans who wanted power to remain with the states, consumed energy and created instability. The Republic fought multiple wars against England, against France, sometimes against both simultaneously. These wars were costly, required raising taxes, disrupted trade. The banking system, which had been so innovative, showed vulnerabilities. Credit bubbles formed and burst. Speculation in company shares and commodities created cycles of boom and bust. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, which had seemed so stable, faced crises when major trading houses failed and couldn't meet their obligations. The interconnectedness of the financial system, where merchants extended credit to each other in complex webs, meant that one major failure could trigger a cascade. Perhaps most fundamentally, other nations were catching up. The innovations that had given the Dutch their edge, the fluid design, the joint stock company, systematic cartography and navigation, these were no longer secret. English and French shipbuilders built their own efficient cargo ships. English and French merchants formed their own joint stock companies. The knowledge that had been concentrated in Amsterdam spread across Europe. Yet it would be wrong to see this as a story of simple decline. The Dutch Republic in the early 18th century was still wealthy, still influential, still home to significant commerce and culture. Amsterdam remained an important financial centre. Even if it was no longer the unquestioned centre of European trade, Dutch bankers financed ventures across the continent. Dutch investors held shares in foreign companies. The wealth accumulated during the Golden Age didn't disappear, it just spread more widely, shared with competitors who had learned Dutch methods. What ended was not Dutch prosperity, but Dutch dominance. The period when a small republic could dictate terms to larger nations through commercial and naval power, when Amsterdam was the undisputed centre of world trade, this was what faded. The Dutch remained important players in European commerce and politics, but they were no longer the dominant player. They had created a system, and that system had been so successful that others adopted it, and in adopting it, ended Dutch monopoly on its benefits. There's something almost inevitable about this pattern. Success creates imitators. Monopoly creates incentives to develop alternatives. The very openness and tolerance that made the Dutch Republic attractive to merchants and scholars from across Europe meant that knowledge and methods spread, couldn't be kept as proprietary secrets. The Golden Age contained the seeds of its own ending, not through failure, but through success. And so we arrive at a point where we must begin to think not about what was built, but about what endured, not about the height of power, but about the legacy left behind. The Golden Age ended, as all Golden Ages must, but it left marks on the world that persist. And it's to those enduring legacies, to what remains when the wealth and power have faded, that we now turn our attention as we enter the final act of our journey together. There was no single moment when the Golden Age ended, no date you can point to and say, this is when it was over. Instead, there was a gradual shift, a slow recognition that the conditions that had created such extraordinary prosperity were changing, that the future would be different from the past. By the early 18th century, this recognition had become widespread. Though the Dutch continued to live quite well, their accumulated wealth sustaining them even as new wealth came more slowly. The War of Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1700 to 1713, was perhaps the clearest sign that the balance of power had shifted. The Dutch Republic participated in this war as part of a coalition against France. And while they were on the winning side, the cost was enormous. Thousands of Dutch soldiers died, the public debt increased massively, and at the end of it all, the commercial benefits went primarily to England. The Dutch had fought to prevent French dominance of Europe, a worthy goal. But they emerged from the war exhausted and financially strained. The financial strain showed itself in various ways. Taxes increased to service the war debt. Investment capital that might have funded new commercial ventures went instead to government bonds. The innovative entrepreneurial spirit that had characterized the early 17th century gave way to a more conservative approach, a focus on managing existing wealth rather than creating new fortunes. This was understandable, rational even, but it meant that the dynamic quality of the Golden Age was lost. The VOC continued to operate, continued to ship goods from Asia, but its profitability declined. The company paid smaller dividends to shareholders, sometimes no dividends at all. The share price, which had been as high as 600% of its original value, gradually declined. By the mid-18th century, the VOC was sustained more by momentum and established networks than by innovative commercial practice. It would limp along until 1799, when it was finally dissolved, its debts assumed by the Dutch government, its assets sold off. In Amsterdam, the visible signs of decline were subtle at first. The grand houses along the canals remained, though they might pass from merchant families to rentiers, people who lived off investments rather than active commerce. The warehouses still held goods, though perhaps not in the same volume or variety. The ships still sailed, though they were increasingly likely to be carrying goods for others rather than for Dutch account. The painting that had flourished during the Golden Age also declined, though more slowly. There were still talented painters in the 18th century, but they worked in different styles, often more influenced by French fashions than by the Dutch tradition. The market for paintings contracted as wealth became concentrated in fewer hands. Fewer middle-class families commissioning landscapes and still lifes meant fewer painters could make a living from their art. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological, a shift in how the Dutch saw themselves and their place in the world. During the Golden Age, there had been a sense of possibility, a belief that through ingenuity and hard work, a small nation could accomplish great things, could punch above its weight. By the 18th century, this belief had faded. The Dutch became more cautious, more defensive, more focused on preserving what they had rather than expanding. This was not irrationality. The Dutch faced real threats surrounded by larger, more powerful nations, France to the south, England across the North Sea, both capable of mobilizing resources that dwarfed what the Republic could manage. The prudent course was to avoid provoking these powers, to maintain neutrality when possible, to accept a diminished role in exchange for survival. But prudence, however rational, lacked the excitement and ambition that had characterized the earlier period. There were still moments of revival, brief periods when it seemed the old spirit might return. The Patriot movement of the 1780s called for political reform, for a return to republican virtue, for resistance to foreign influence. But these movements were divided and ultimately unsuccessful. When French revolutionary armies invaded the Netherlands in 1795, they met little effective resistance. The republic that had fought Spain for 80 years fell in a matter of weeks. Yet even in decline, even as political independence was lost, something of the Golden Age persisted. The institutions created during that period, the banks and trading companies and civic organizations, continued to function. The habits of commerce, the networks of trade, the systems of law and property, these endured through regime change. Amsterdam remained a financial centre even when it was no longer the financial centre. And the physical city remained. The canals and houses and churches built during the Golden Age, they stood as testimony to what had been achieved, to the wealth and ambition and taste of a previous generation. Visitors to Amsterdam in the 18th and 19th centuries walked the same streets, crossed the same bridges, admired the same buildings that had been new in 1650. The past was present, unavoidably so, in the built environment. What we see then is not a catastrophic collapse, but a gentle decline. A slow fade from dominance to respectability, from being the leading commercial power to being one among several. This is perhaps a more common pattern than dramatic collapse, more typical of how historical periods end, not with a bang but with a gradual diminishment, with each generation a bit less prosperous or less powerful or less innovative than the last, until one day you look back and realise that something has been lost. But loss of power is not loss of value. What the Dutch created during their golden age, the systems and structures, the art and ideas, these had value independent of Dutch political dominance. And it's to those enduring contributions to what the golden age gave to the world that we now turn our attention in our final chapters as we begin the slow drift toward closure and rest. Walk through Amsterdam today, and you are walking through a museum, though not one confined to a building. The city itself is the artifact, the most complete physical legacy of the Dutch Golden Age. Those concentric canals, the Herengracht and Keizersgracht and Prinsengracht, still follow the same curves they did in 1620. The houses that line them, though some have been modified and many have changed hands countless times, are recognisably the same structures that 17th century merchants built and inhabited. This is remarkable when you consider how much has changed in the centuries since. Wars have been fought, governments have risen and fallen, economies have transformed from commercial to industrial to post-industrial, and yet these buildings stand, still serving their purpose, though that purpose has evolved. Where merchants once stored spices in warehouses, there might now be apartments or offices or restaurants, but the structure itself, the brick walls and wooden beams, the narrow stairs and large windows, these remain. The preservation was not entirely intentional, not in the sense of conscious historical preservation that modern societies practice. For much of the 18th and 19th centuries, these buildings simply remained in use because they were still functional, still suitable for their purposes. Amsterdam did not experience the kind of rapid industrial growth that destroyed historic centres in other cities. There was no compelling economic reason to tear down the old canal houses and replace them with modern structures, so they stayed. By the 20th century, as Amsterdam began to grow more rapidly, there was increasing recognition that these buildings had historical value worth protecting. Preservation laws were passed, the canal ring was eventually designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and careful regulations govern what can and cannot be done to the historic structures. You can renovate the interior, can update the plumbing and electrical systems, but the facade must be maintained, the basic character preserved. What this means is that you can stand on a bridge crossing the Herengracht and see essentially what someone in 1650 would have seen. The details are different: electric streetlights instead of oil lamps, bicycles instead of horses, modern boats instead of cargo vessels. But the fundamental composition, the relationship between water and architecture, between space and structure, this is the same. Consider what this tells us about the quality of the original construction. These buildings have stood for more than 300 years in a difficult environment. Amsterdam's soft soil, its high water table, its wet climate, all of these conspire against wooden structures. Yet the piles driven in the 17th century still support buildings in the 21st. The wooden beams still bear loads. The brick walls still keep out the weather. This was building to last. Not from sentiment, but from practical necessity. Merchants who invested in a house wanted it to serve their families for generations. The aesthetic also endures. The elegance of Dutch gables, the proportion of windows to wall, the use of brick in shades from red to brown to grey, creating subtle variations within overall harmony. These design principles influenced architecture far beyond the Netherlands. Dutch colonial architecture in places like New Amsterdam, which would become New York, carried these forms across the Atlantic. Dutch traders building in Asian ports created hybrid architectures that blended these elements with local traditions. But perhaps the most profound aspect of this architectural legacy is what it represents philosophically. The canal houses of Amsterdam were designed to be both beautiful and functional. Neither quality sacrificed for the other. They were expensive enough to demonstrate the wealth and taste of their owners, but not so extravagant as to be wasteful. They integrated commercial and residential functions, reflecting a society where work and life were not rigidly separated. They were built to harmonize with each other, creating streetscapes rather than individual showpieces, reflecting a culture that valued collective prosperity over individual display. This approach to building, this balance between aesthetic and practical considerations, between individual expression and communal harmony, represents a particular philosophy about how humans should inhabit space. It's a philosophy that prioritizes long-term thinking over short-term gain, that values quality construction, that creates public beauty through private investment. These are not universal values. Not every culture or period has shared them, but they were deeply Dutch values in the 17th century. And because the buildings remain, because you can still walk these streets and cross these bridges, these values remain present in a tangible way. They're not just historical ideas, but lived realities. People still live in these houses, still look out these windows onto these canals. The past is not separate from the present, but integrated with it. The 17th century bleeding into the 21st through the medium of brick and timber and water. There's something profoundly moving about this continuity, about the fact that a human creation from so long ago still serves its purpose, still brings beauty and function to daily life. It suggests that some things, if built with enough care and thought, can transcend their time, can continue to have meaning and value long after the circumstances that created them have vanished. The merchants who built these houses are gone, their commercial empires ended, their wealth dispersed. But what they built remains, and in remaining continues to shape how people live and think about urban space. But stone and brick, buildings and bridges, these are only one kind of legacy. The Dutch Golden Age also left legacies in canvas and paint, in images that captured not just what the world looked like, but how to see it. And it's to that visual legacy, to the paintings that still hang in museums and homes around the world, that we now turn our attention. In the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam hangs Rembrandt's Night Watch, that enormous canvas we mentioned earlier, and every day hundreds of people stand before it, looking at the same paint Rembrandt applied in 1642. They see the same faces, the same light and shadow, the same frozen moment of civic pride and martial pageantry. The painting has endured for nearly 400 years, survived wars and moves and even an attack by a knife-wielding vandal, and it remains as Rembrandt created it, a window into both the 17th century and the mind of genius. But the Night Watch is just one painting among thousands that survive from the Dutch Golden Age. In museums across the world you can find Dutch landscapes and still lifes, portraits and genre scenes, each one a preserved moment of observation, a record of how Dutch painters saw their world. This is an extraordinary legacy, perhaps the most accessible aspect of the Golden Age for modern people. You don't need to read Dutch or understand 17th century economics or politics. You can simply look at a Vermeer and experience something of what Vermeer saw. Consider what painting does that no other medium can quite replicate. Vermeer's Girl with a pearl earring shows a young woman turning to look over her shoulder, her lips slightly parted, wearing a blue and yellow turban and a large pearl earring. The painting is simple in composition, just a figure against a dark background, but it's mesmerizing. You feel like you could understand something about this person if you looked long enough, though she lived centuries ago and was probably just a model whose name we don't even know. This emotional connection across time is part of what makes the paintings valuable. They're not just historical documents, though, they are that, showing us what people wore and how rooms were furnished and what the Dutch landscape looked like. They're also emotional and aesthetic experiences that work regardless of historical context. A painting of flowers in a vase is beautiful, whether you understand the symbolism of tulips in 17th century culture, or simply appreciate the skill with which the petals are rendered. The technical quality of Dutch Golden Age painting has never been surpassed in some respects. The understanding of light, the ability to create the illusion of texture and depth, the careful composition that makes each element work together, these are skills that contemporary painters study and try to learn. The methods these painters used, the layering of transparent glazes, the careful preparation of surfaces, the mixing of pigments, this knowledge has been preserved and passed down through centuries. But there's also something about the subjects these painters chose that makes their work endure. They painted ordinary life with extraordinary attention. A maid pouring milk, a woman reading a letter, people playing cards in a tavern, fishermen working on a beach. These are not grand historical events or mythological scenes, but moments of daily existence. In choosing to paint these subjects with such care, Dutch artists suggested that ordinary life was worthy of serious attention, that the mundane contained its own beauty and meaning. This democratization of subject matter was revolutionary in its way. Traditionally, painting had been about power, about religious subjects or powerful patrons. Dutch painting suggested that anyone's life could be worthy of art, that the domestic interior or the local landscape was as valid a subject as a royal palace or a battlefield. This was consistent with Dutch republican values, with the elevation of the Burgher class, with the idea that ordinary citizens living ordinary lives were the foundation of society. The still life paintings carry this even further. A table laid with food and drink, pewter and porcelain, nautical instruments and books. These paintings show material objects arranged with careful attention to composition and lighting. On one level, they're simply beautiful, a pleasure to look at. On another level, they're commentaries on wealth and mortality, on the pleasure of material goods and the inevitability of decay. The gorgeous fruits are beginning to spoil, the flower petals are falling, the expensive watch reminds us that time passes. This ability to work on multiple levels simultaneously, to be both beautiful and meaningful, decorative and philosophical, is characteristic of the best Dutch painting. You can appreciate a Rembrandt portrait simply as a portrait, a skilled representation of a human face. But you can also see in it a meditation on aging and mortality, an exploration of what it means to be human, a demonstration of how light can reveal and conceal simultaneously. The painting rewards both casual viewing and deep contemplation. The influence of Dutch Golden Age painting spread across European art. The careful observation of light, the attention to material textures, the willingness to paint ordinary subjects, these became part of the vocabulary of Western art. Later movements, from Impressionism to Realism, owed debts to Dutch precedents. Vermeer in particular became a touchstone for artists interested in light and composition. His sparse interiors and subtle colour harmonies studied and emulated. And beyond influence on other artists, the paintings themselves continue to give pleasure and provoke thought. People who know nothing about the Dutch Golden Age can stand before these paintings and feel something, can be moved by the play of light across a face or the precise rendering of a lemon peel. This is what great art does. It transcends its original context, speaks across time and culture, creates connections between the person who made it and the person who views it. So when we talk about the legacy of the Dutch Golden Age in painting, we're talking about both tangible objects, these canvases that survive in museums and collections, and something more intangible, an influence on how we see and understand the world, a contribution to the vocabulary of human expression. The Dutch painters taught us to look carefully at ordinary things, to find beauty in everyday light, to value the material world while recognizing its transience. These are lessons that remain relevant, that continue to shape how we think about art and life. But art was not the only realm where the Dutch Golden Age left intellectual legacy. There were also ideas, written and printed, distributed and debated, that shaped European thought in profound ways. And it's to that legacy of ideas, to what the Dutch contributed to human knowledge and philosophy, that we now turn our attention. Visit Amsterdam today and you will find a city that has made peace with its past, neither obsessively preserving every detail nor carelessly abandoning its heritage. The canal ring remains, those concentric waterways laid out in the early 17th century, but it's integrated into a modern city with trams and bicycles, coffee shops and tech startups, tourists and residents sharing the same streets their ancestors walked 400 years ago. The houses along the Herengracht are still there, many of them now museums or offices or expensive apartments. You can tour them, see how the wealthy lived during the Golden Age. Admire the paintings on the walls and the period furniture. Try to imagine what it was like when these were not historical artifacts but someone's home. Some houses have been restored meticulously to their 17th century appearance. Others have been modernised inside while maintaining the historic facade, creating an interesting contrast between old and new. The museums hold the paintings. The Rijksmuseum's collection of Dutch Golden Age art is perhaps the finest in the world. Room after room of Rembrandts and Vermeers, Hals and Steens, landscapes and still lifes and portraits. On any given day, the museum is full of visitors from around the world, standing before these paintings, some with audio guides explaining the historical context, others simply looking, experiencing these works as purely visual phenomena. But the legacy is not confined to museums and tourist sites. It's woven into the fabric of modern Amsterdam in subtler ways. The tolerance that allowed religious minorities and controversial thinkers to flourish in the 17th century has evolved into contemporary Dutch liberalism, a society that prides itself on tolerance for diverse lifestyles and viewpoints. This is not without tensions and complications, modern debates about immigration and integration, and the limits of tolerance, but the historical precedent matters, shapes how these debates unfold. The commercial culture persists as well, though in transformed ways. Amsterdam is still a financial centre, home to banks and trading firms, though the goods being traded now are more likely to be financial instruments than physical commodities. The Dutch remain practical, commercially minded people, comfortable with trade and negotiation, skilled at creating systems that work efficiently. The same pragmatism that led to the development of the Vloot and the joint stock company manifests in contemporary Dutch approaches to business and governance. The harbour, where VOC ships once unloaded spices and silk, is now a working port for a different kind of economy. Containers rather than barrels, modern shipping rather than sailing vessels. But shipping remains important to the Dutch economy, and the relationship between the Netherlands and the sea, that fundamental aspect of Dutch identity forged over centuries of living in a waterlogged landscape, continues to shape national priorities. The Dutch remain world leaders in water management, exporting their expertise in flood control and land reclamation to other nations facing similar challenges. Walk through the Jordaan, that neighbourhood developed during the Golden Age expansion, and you'll find working-class routes transformed into trendy cafes and galleries, gentrification bringing new life, but also changing character. This is the tension in any historic city, how to preserve what matters while allowing evolution and change. Amsterdam has handled this reasonably well, maintaining enough of the historic fabric to keep the city recognisable, while allowing enough change to keep it vital. The canals themselves are perhaps the most powerful symbol of continuity. They look much as they did in the 17th century, the water reflecting brick facades and sky, trees lining the banks, bridges crossing at regular intervals. You can take a canal boat tour, float along the same waterways that carried cargo during the Golden Age. See the city from water level as the merchants would have seen it. In winter, if it gets cold enough, which happens less often than it once did, people still ice skate on the frozen canals, a tradition that connects back centuries. But there's also an acknowledgement of the darker aspects of the Golden Age legacy. The Rijksmuseum has updated its displays to include information about the VOC's role in colonialism and slavery, about the violence that undergirded commercial success. There's an ongoing conversation in the Netherlands about this history, about how to remember and acknowledge the harm done in the name of profit, about what responsibility contemporary Dutch society bears for historical injustices. This is healthy, this willingness to complicate the narrative, to see the Golden Age not just as a period of achievement but as a period of contradictions, of great accomplishments built on problematic foundations. It allows for a more honest relationship with the past, one that honours genuine achievements while acknowledging genuine harms. The paintings are still beautiful, the canal houses still elegant, the intellectual contributions still significant, but they exist in context, part of a larger story that includes exploitation and violence, alongside artistry and innovation. What emerges is a picture of a city and a nation that has integrated its past into its present, neither denying history nor being trapped by it. The Golden Age matters to contemporary Amsterdam, shapes its identity and its urban landscape, but it doesn't dominate. The city has moved on, evolved, changed with the times, and yet the past remains present, visible in architecture and art, influential in culture and values. This seems like a healthy relationship with history, neither nostalgic glorification nor dismissive rejection, but acknowledgement and integration. The past is honoured for what it achieved, critiqued for what it did wrong, and learned from in both cases. And perhaps this is the ultimate legacy of the Dutch Golden Age, not any particular achievement or artefact, but a model of how a small nation with limited resources can, through ingenuity and cooperation, through systematization and hard work, through tolerance and openness to ideas, create something remarkable that endures long after the specific circumstances that created it have passed. And so we come to the end of our journey through the Dutch Golden Age, ready to gather together all these threads, all these observations and insights, into a final reflection on what it all means, what we can take from this story of a remarkable century. It's time to bring our exploration to its gentle close, and so we come to the end of our slow drift through the Dutch Golden Age, that extraordinary century when a small nation of water and wind became the wealthiest place on earth. We've travelled together from the marshy coastline of the Netherlands to the tropical harbours of Indonesia, from the counting houses of Amsterdam to the studios where Rembrandt painted light, from the ships that sailed to the east to the canals that still flow through Amsterdam today. It's been a long journey, more than 2 hours together, and I hope it's been one that brought you both knowledge and peace. Let's think about what we've discovered. Not as a list of facts, but as a set of understandings, of insights into human possibility and limitation. The Dutch Golden Age shows us what's possible when conditions align, when geography and politics and culture combine to create opportunities that clever, hard-working people can exploit. A nation with no natural resources beyond water and wind built an empire through ingenuity, through designing better ships and organising more efficient companies, through careful bookkeeping and systematic navigation. But it also shows us the limits and costs of such success. The prosperity was built partially on violence and exploitation, on wars fought for commercial advantage, on slavery and displacement of peoples in distant colonies. The same rational calculation that made Dutch commerce efficient was applied to the most brutal aspects of empire. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but it's necessary. The Golden Age was truly golden for some, significantly less so for others. What endures, we've seen, is not the empire or the commercial dominance, both of which faded by the 18th century, but the cultural and intellectual legacy. The paintings still hang in museums, beautiful and meaningful. The buildings still stand along the canals, elegant and functional. The ideas about tolerance and empiricism, about international law and scientific method, still influence how we think about the world. These achievements matter, and they matter independent of the political and economic power that has long since passed. There's something profound in this pattern, that cultural achievements outlast political power. The Spanish Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire, all were greater in territory and military might than the Dutch could ever claim. But Dutch painting, Dutch architecture, Dutch contributions to philosophy and science, these stand alongside the cultural achievements of those larger empires. Size of territory doesn't determine cultural impact. What matters is whether a society creates conditions where human creativity and intelligence can flourish, where people are free to paint and think and write and build. The Dutch Golden Age also teaches us about community and cooperation. The Dutch Republic was not a monarchy where one person made decisions and others obeyed. It was a republic where decisions required consensus, where merchants worked together through companies and guilds, where individual ambition had to be balanced with collective good. This wasn't always easy or efficient, but it created stability and allowed prosperity to be more widely shared than in more hierarchical societies. There's a lesson here about scale and possibility. The Netherlands was small, is still small. It would be easy to assume that small nations can't accomplish great things, that size of territory and population determines importance. But the Dutch showed that a small nation with the right systems, the right values, the right willingness to innovate, can have an impact far beyond what its size would suggest. This is encouraging for small nations today. A reminder that influence comes not just from size, but from what you contribute to human culture and knowledge. And there's a lesson about transience, about accepting that nothing lasts forever. The Dutch Golden Age ended, the commercial dominance faded, the VOC dissolved, the political power diminished. But this wasn't failure exactly. It was change, the inevitable evolution of human circumstances. Empires rise and fall, economic systems evolve, power shifts. What the Dutch created during their golden century was never going to last forever, and perhaps they understood this. Perhaps that's why they painted still lifes with rotting fruit and wilting flowers, memento mori reminding viewers that everything passes. But impermanence doesn't mean meaninglessness. The fact that the Dutch Golden Age ended doesn't diminish what was achieved during that century. The paintings are still beautiful, the ideas still influential, the buildings still standing. What was created continues to have value, continues to enrich human experience. Centuries after the specific conditions that created it have vanished. This is as close to immortality as humans can achieve, not living forever, but creating things that outlast us, that continue to matter to people we will never meet. And so we return to Amsterdam, to those quiet canals where the story began. The water still flows, dark and still, reflecting buildings that have seen centuries pass. The bridges still arch over the water, connecting one bank to another, one century to the next. Walk these streets, and you're walking where merchants once hurried to the exchange, where painters carried canvases to patrons, where sailors returned from voyages that lasted years, where ordinary people lived ordinary lives that accumulated into something extraordinary. The Dutch Golden Age was a moment in human history, a century when conditions aligned to create remarkable prosperity and cultural achievement. It passed, as all moments pass, but it left marks on the world that we can still see and feel and learn from. The canals remember, the paintings remember, the ideas remember, and we remember, learning from both the achievements and the failures, from both the beauty created and the harm done, trying to understand what it means to be human, to build and create and strive, knowing that nothing we build will last forever, but building anyway, creating beauty and knowledge and systems that might, if we're lucky and careful, outlast us and enrich the lives of people yet to come. And with that thought, with that recognition of continuity across time, of connection between past and present and future, let's bring our journey to its close. We've sailed together from the North Sea to the Indies and back, from the early 1600s to today, and now it's time to rest, to let these stories settle, to drift towards sleep with images of tall ships and quiet canals, of light falling across painted canvas, of windmills turning against wide Dutch skies. There's nowhere we need to be, nothing we need to do. The journey is complete. Let yourself rest now. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey into the Dutch Golden Age. We've spent nearly 2.5 hours together, travelling from marshy coastlines to tropical spice islands, from merchant counting houses to artist studios, from the height of prosperity to the gentle fade of empire. Thank you for your time, your attention, your willingness to drift with me through this story of water and wind and human ambition. From the land reclaimed from the sea to the ships that sailed to the ends of the known world. From the paintings that captured light itself to the ideas that shaped modern thought, we've explored how a small nation became, for one extraordinary century, the centre of the world. We saw how they engineered their landscape, building dikes and windmills to create land where water had been. We sailed with them to Batavia, understanding the grinding months at sea, the dangers and discomforts of those voyages. We walked through the warehouses of Amsterdam where the wealth of empire accumulated, and we stood in the presence of paintings that still, centuries later, take our breath away. The answer to the question that has guided us, how did this small nation achieve such remarkable things, is both simple and complex. They did it through ingenuity and hard work, certainly, through innovation in ship design and business organisation, but also through their particular culture, their emphasis on cooperation and rational calculation, their tolerance for diverse ideas and people, their willingness to learn from observation rather than simply accepting tradition. And they did it, we must acknowledge honestly, through violence and exploitation, through the brutal enforcement of commercial monopolies, through systems of slavery and colonial domination that enriched Amsterdam while devastating communities across Asia. Both truths exist simultaneously. The Golden Age was genuinely golden, genuinely an age of remarkable achievement, and it was also built on foundations that included profound moral failures. Acknowledging both doesn't diminish the achievements, it contextualizes them, helps us understand them more completely. If you found peace in this slow exploration of history, if these stories of merchants and painters and sailors helped carry you toward rest, then I hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? Do you have connections to the Netherlands or to this period of history? What aspects of the Golden Age do you find most fascinating or most troubling? Your thoughts and reflections are always welcome. Wherever you are in the world right now, whether it's early morning or late at night, whether you're in a quiet bedroom or a bustling city, I hope you found some comfort in these stories. Some peace in this long contemplation of a time when humans created beauty and knowledge and systems that endured. I hope your breathing has slowed, your thoughts have quieted, your body feels heavy and warm and ready for rest. Imagine, if you will, standing on a bridge crossing one of Amsterdam's canals on a quiet evening. The water is still, reflecting the buildings and the sky. The light is fading, that soft blue twilight that seems to last forever in summer. You can smell the water, the trees that line the canal banks, maybe a hint of coffee from a nearby cafe. There's a boat moving slowly on the canal, making barely a ripple, heading somewhere you don't know and don't need to know. And in this moment you can feel the presence of all those who came before, who walked these same streets, who looked at this same water, who lived and worked and loved and died in this place. The merchants counting their guilders, the painters mixing their colours, the sailors returning from distant seas, the families making their homes in narrow houses, all of them part of the long human story that continues still. You're part of it too, connected across time by the simple act of attention, of caring about these stories, of finding meaning in the lives of people who lived centuries ago. The Dutch built something remarkable during their Golden Age, something that combined beauty and function, prosperity and culture, individual ambition, and collective achievement. It didn't last forever. Nothing does. But while it lasted, it was extraordinary. And what they created, the paintings and buildings and ideas, these endure still, continue to enrich human experience, continue to teach us about what's possible when people work together with skill and determination and vision. So sleep well tonight. Dream, if you dream, of tall ships with white sails catching the wind, of windmills turning slowly across flat green landscapes, of light falling through leaded windows onto polished floors, of tulips blooming in quiet gardens, of water flowing endlessly along ancient canals. Dream of a time when the world seemed full of possibility, when a small nation dared to reach across oceans, when merchants became patrons of art, when painters learned to capture light itself, when scholars questioned everything and published their questions for all to read. Dream of Amsterdam in its golden age, prosperous and beautiful and complicated and human, a place where people lived lives not so different from ours, working and hoping and building, trying to create something that would last, something meaningful, something good. They succeeded, more than they could have known. Their city still stands, their paintings still move us, their ideas still influence how we think. They reached across time to touch us, and in remembering them we honour what they achieved and learn from what they did wrong. Good night, wherever you are. Good night to all who sailed and traded and painted and built. Good night to the merchants and the sailors, the artists and the engineers, the dreamers and the pragmatists who together created something remarkable. Good night to Amsterdam, the city of canals and light, still beautiful after all these years. Good night to the past that shaped our present. Good night to the waters that still flow, the paintings that still hang, the ideas that still matter. Rest well. The Golden Age has ended, but what it created endures, quiet and patient, waiting in museums and canals and pages, ready to teach us still. Good night.